Ron Weitzer is Professor of Sociology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He is a well-known writer and academic dealing with various issues. Those pertaining to our discussions today are a number of articles that he's written examining the American campaign against trafficking, beginning in the early 1990s, and so has been at it for some time, and the institutionalization of official state discourse, policymaking, and enforcement practices with regards to trafficking. He's currently co-editing a special issue on human trafficking for the Annals of the American Academy of Social and Political Science. And so I would invite Ron to the dais to give us a talk on popular claims versus evidence-based conclusions in human trafficking. Cheers.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for sponsoring this very unique panel. Let's see, okay. You mentioned earlier that there is some controversy regarding trafficking in general and sex trafficking, and I think I'll try to explain why that is today, as well as suggest some alternatives to what I consider to be the dominant discourse and policy regarding human trafficking in general and sex trafficking in particular. Most of what I'm talking about today is sex trafficking, but some of it does apply to human trafficking more generally, other types of trafficking into other labor arenas. And most of what I say is focused on the US, but I think a lot will also apply to other countries and internationally as well. And I want to give some history and background to this problem and issue. It did arise in the late 1990s in the US as an issue, frequent media reporting, the proliferation of anti-trafficking groups around the country and throughout the world, an increasing amount of state and international funding and enforcement efforts, and quite a lot of money is being spent in dealing with the problem. I think there are four major claims that are made frequently about human trafficking, and I want to evaluate each one of those claims and suggest that some of them, maybe all of them, are based on fairly thin ice. The first is that the magnitude of trafficking is huge, and some people use the term epidemic. The second is that the problem is growing. There's increasing cases of victims over time. Third, that it's the second or third largest organized crime enterprise in the world, after drug trafficking and arms trafficking. And fourth, that sex trafficking is much more prevalent than other types of trafficking, like trafficking, agricultural, industrial, and so on. So those are the four, I think, core claims that have been made frequently, both in research and by activists and government officials. Are these claims evidence-based? Well, I would argue that they may be true, each one of those four. But so far, I've seen no compelling evidence to support any of the four claims. And one could even question whether those claims can be substantiated at the macro level. And when I say macro, I mean at the national level or internationally. There was a study done by Sheldon Zhang at San Diego State University. They examined over 100 academic articles based on trafficking and found that very few of them used any original data. And most of them were treated the claims of government organizations and NGOs as evidence. So very little in the way of empirical data collection to address these claims. In terms of the history in the US, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 criminalizes the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And anyone who is under 18 is by definition a victim, and any adult who's been induced by force, fraud, or coercion would be considered a victim in the US. That's a somewhat narrower law than some other countries and some international conventions. So adults who sell sex willingly with assistance would not be considered trafficking victims under US law. The paper critiques what I call this dominant paradigm regarding both sex trafficking and prostitution more generally. Looks at the core claims in terms of the magnitude, the profits, and the experiences that people who are trafficked endure. It critiques government policies based on the paradigm, and I try to recommend what I think is a superior alternative to the dominant one. There are two different, maybe more than two, but at least two types of anti-trafficking organizations, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 are those organizations that do not condemn prostitution or other types of sex work and focus on coercion and deception and are perhaps committed to assisting victims in those particular kinds of cases. Type 2 organizations equate sex trafficking with sex work, condemn prostitution, and these type 2 organizations are the ones that have been dominant in public debates. They've had the most influence on public policies, certainly in the US under the Bush administration. They're very influential and they're extremely well funded compared to the type 1 organizations, which have been marginalized and have not been, their voices have not been heard. Type 2 organizations subscribe to what I call the oppression paradigm regarding sex work. And I'll detail what that means in a minute. Again, by way of background, I think this movement began in earnest in the late 1990s. Prior to that, there wasn't much discussion or even the use of the term human trafficking, except for about a century earlier during the white slave trade discussion. It does involve an interesting coalition between left and right organizations, the religious right in the US, along with some leftist groups, often what I would call maybe radical feminist groups. And the concerns with regarding trafficking trumped the differences between these very different left-right coalition partners. And this very same coalition, with a few of the same members, fought pornography in the United States in the 1980s with a degree of success until the internet came along and changed everything. Just a few examples of movement members on the right. And I'm not listing everyone here. And as you can see, there's a religious characteristic to many of them, faith-based. And a few of the movement members on the left. I think in Europe, the European Women's Lobby would fit here. And what's interesting is the mainstream women's rights organizations in the US, like the National Organization for Women, have not really been active participants in this debate. If you go to their webpage, there's very little discussion of trafficking. So back to the oppression paradigm. It has a number of aspects, and this regards all types of sex work. That violence is omnipresent in both prostitution and sex trafficking. That sex workers are victims by definition. That most of them, if not all of them, lack agency. That trafficking and prostitution are linked and for many advocates, equated. And I'll give a few examples of that in a second. And that legalization of prostitution would only make the problem worse because it would normalize the trade and expand trafficking into sex work venues. Just a few examples of some movement activists and their claims. that illustrate the oppression paradigm. Donna Hughes is a professor at the University of Rhode Island. Most sex workers are or originally started out as trafficked women and girls. And she calls for a relinking of trafficking and prostitution in order to combat the commercial sex trade as a whole. Melissa Farley, a false distinction between prostitution and trafficking has hindered efforts to abolish prostitution, suggesting that it's prostitution, not so much trafficking per se, that is to be targeted. And I just threw in feminist icon Catherine McKinnon, who brings pornography into the equation. And very interesting formulation here, where I've sort of highlighted some of the key words. Pornography creates the demand for prostitution, hence for trafficking, because it is itself a form of prostitution and trafficking. And you could read the rest. A lot of conflation here between key terms, unfortunately, and definitions by fiat. So that's the oppression paradigm that I think has colored many people's understandings of sex trafficking and sex work in the United States and throughout the world. During the Bush government, they fully embraced this paradigm. And individuals like Melissa Farley and Donna Hughes had pretty good access to the Bush administration, participated in conferences frequently, lobbied, and people of their persuasion had a lot of influence on policy and practice. And according to the US State Department in 2004, these kinds of claims were being made in one of the key documents that the State Department produced. There was no doubt that prostitution fuels trafficking and has led to the growth of modern-day slavery, according to the Bush administration. And during this period, individuals in these are type 2 organizations, not type 1, had open access to the Bush government. The government endorsed their basic claims, both in pronouncements and in published documents. It funded these type 2 organizations quite lavishly and denied funding to type 1 organizations if they refused to sign an anti-prostitution pledge, and denied funding to researchers who wanted to study trafficking if they would not sign an anti-prostitution pledge. So even when they put out a request for proposals for a literature review on trafficking, you would have had to have signed an anti-prostitution pledge to get money to simply do a literature review during the Bush administration. Okay. So that's by way of background. So what I want to do is sort of go through each of these major claims and assess the degree to which they stand up to the evidence. And I'll begin with claim number 1. It is in advocates' interest to claim that the numbers are huge and growing. It attracts media attention, it attracts public attention, and it attracts funding. This does not mean that that's their only interest. Many of them do have humanitarian interests as well, but clearly inflating the size of the problem and the trajectory of the problem as increasing dramatically over time is to the benefit of these organizations. But the claimed number of victims vacillates, fluctuates tremendously. And what we see in government reports and other estimates are declines, decreases in the number of alleged victims. In the United States, the State Department and CIA originally estimated 50,000 individuals were trafficked into the United States every year. But by 2004 to 7, that number was scaled down dramatically. And a meta-analysis conducted by Amy Farrell and her colleagues of 207 studies found a huge range in the estimates regarding both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Worldwide, the estimates range from 600,000 to millions. Now, no one would claim that there should be an equivalence between the number of victims identified and assisted and the number of victims out there. But we do have to raise questions about the disconnect between the number of victims located and assisted and the number of people who are claimed to be victims. So in 2010, 0.4% of victims worldwide, and these are all human trafficking victims, had been officially identified and assisted according to the State Department. That assumes that the total number of victims is known. And there's no mention in the report of where that figure comes from and how they arrived at it. The Justice Department in the US in 2005 made this intriguing comment. The government must address the incongruity between the estimated number of victims trafficked into the US and the number of victims found between 2001 and 2004. Updating those figures a bit, between 2001 and mid-2008, about 1,400 trafficking victims had been identified in the US. And from 2008 to 2010, 218 sex trafficking victims and 39 labor trafficking victims had been officially identified as confirmed cases. This is a tiny fraction of what we might expect based on the 14,005 and the 17,005 number of new victims each year. So these are annual figures. You could say the number of victims identified, assisted, confirmed is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think many people would subscribe to that view. And I might as well. But this quote from Louise Shelley, who has a major book called Human Trafficking. Some of you have read it. So she's a major figure in the debate, academic. Estimated 500,000 to 4 million victims trafficked annually. These statistics reflect a massive impunity for traffickers. There we see an uncritical acceptance of the official statistics, something all criminologists are cautioned not to do. And it's possible that the number of prosecutions are more consistent with the reality, the magnitude of the problem, than the extremely high estimates. So it's at least possible that the bottom of the iceberg is a better reflection of the number of victims than the tip of the iceberg conception. I just want to throw that out as a possibility. Other analysts, including the Government Accountability Office in the US, which conducts annual reviews of different policies, wrote a very damning report in 2006 criticizing the numbers that the government itself and others had been throwing around. They were critical of many reports that lump smuggling, voluntarily assisted migration, with trafficking, coercive or deceptive trafficking. Critical of reports that do not distinguish sex from labor trafficking, from all human trafficking. And so when you read books like Louise Shelley's book, she goes back and forth between the different types of trafficking, and it's not always clear which one she's talking about. And this GAO report was also very critical of the poor data and data analysis procedures that have been used by many researchers and others, and concluded that there was no effective mechanism at that point, 2006, for estimating the number of victims, domestically or internationally. So my argument, and I'll be real interested to see what the presenters this afternoon have to say as well, is that it's impossible to count the number of people involved in any illicit, clandestine activity at the macro level. And I would include arms trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking. And the wildly varying estimates show the futility of counting numbers at the macro level. And when I say macro, I mean internationally or within a particular society. The second argument is that it is possible at the micro level, but only at the micro level, meaning a particular city or perhaps a region of a country, to count the number of victims, but only if the data collection is solid and systematic and rigorous, and if the quality of the data at the end are high. And that unfortunately doesn't happen very often. So I'm arguing in favor of micro-level research and avoiding macro-level numerical estimates and claims. Claim 2, that human trafficking is steadily increasing as a problem throughout the world. Well, the numbers I showed earlier suggest that at least the US government has been scaling down its figures every year. So that's one issue. But here we've got three major authors. Each has written a book on human trafficking. Louise Shelley, Catherine Farr, Siddharth Kara. And here you can see that their claims about a rapidly spreading problem are stated quite adamantly. Kara has two assumptions here, or two claims, that both the demand for sex services has increased, and therefore the increased use of sex slaves. And he has no good data to support either of those. My argument here would be that these claims cannot be documented for three reasons. It's a clandestine, underground, black market, that there's no good baseline to measure changes over time, so we cannot know what's been happening and what the trends are if we have no good data on what the original, let's say 1990 to 2013 trends are. So it's clandestine, there's no baseline, and it's possible that there could be market saturation, particularly regarding sex trafficking. That in a particular society or city, the number of people providing sex for sale maxes out at some level and doesn't continually increase over time. So for those three reasons, I think we have to critically evaluate the claim that it's steadily increasing and becoming a more widespread problem. And again, I'm focusing on sex trafficking, but I think much of what I say could be applied to other arenas as well. But for now, I'm going to stay with sex trafficking. And as I said before, NGOs and governments have been consistently reducing their estimates over time. And why would they be doing that if the problem is growing in terms of prevalence? So claim 2 rests on pretty thin ice. Claim 3. that it's the second or third largest organized crime enterprise and produces the second or third greatest profits for those involved behind drugs and arms trafficking. The United Nations, the USA, and other organizations, NGOs, make these claims. The minimum number I've seen is by the IOM, 5 to 7 billion a year. But then we have Siddharth Kara claiming that 36 billion has been derived from trafficked sex slaves. He also makes some other questionable claims with very precise figures, which raise questions in my mind as to how those are arrived at. He equates, if you read his book, he slips between brothel workers and sex slaves, very flippantly. Flippantly, that's not the right word for that, but casually, yeah, right. And foreign sex workers and trafficked victims. He alternates between them as well. So there's a lot of definitional questions I would have when looking at his book, and given those definitional problems, we have to raise questions about the numerical conclusions he draws as well. The 5 to 7 billion figure was deconstructed by two authors in a very well-conducted analysis of where those figures came from, how they were arrived at, and they concluded that it was simply guesswork based on a number of unknowns. And that's the minimum figure. So if that applies to the minimum figure, we can probably also say similarly for those higher figures. And even though the UN is one of the organizations that makes these kinds of claims, second or third largest criminal enterprise in the world, itself claims that it's impossible to prioritize human trafficking as an issue relative to other threats. So then why is it making that claim? And I would agree with this quotation. Claim number 4, that sex trafficking eclipses labor trafficking. The position of the Bush administration was that yes, that's very much the case, that the majority of trafficking victims in the US and internationally fall prey to the commercial sex trade in the State Department's TIP report 2004. And I'm not sure how many academics, researchers, and NGOs subscribe to that view today, but the Obama administration takes a radically different view in its State Department's recent report. The majority of human trafficking in the world takes the form of forced labor. And if you read the TIP reports, the recent ones, there's much more attention to labor trafficking than to sex trafficking. So there appears to be a shift within the US state regarding which is considered most serious and which deserves the most attention. And they also, unlike the Bush administration, distinguished prostitution from trafficking. And you would never find a comment like this in any of the TIP reports under the Bush administration. Even though the law is consistent with this later point, the discourse during the Bush administration was much broader and equated the two. From what I can tell, and I don't have a lot of data on this, but despite the change in discourse between the two governments, Bush and Obama, that most of the institutional apparatus that was set up during the Bush administration is still in place. Most of the official claims are similar to the Bush administration's. The key law has not been modified in major respects between the two administrations. And government anti-trafficking funding remains pretty much the same, from what I can tell. But I would like a little bit more information on what's actually going on in the Bush administration, and to what degree has there been a shift in not just discourse, but also practice and enforcement patterns from one to the other. Maybe some people here can help me with that. You can? Great. I'd like to know a little bit more about that for sure. I think some of the key personnel in the tip office have been carryovers from the Bush administration to Obama, but some of them have left. So those are the claims, and that's my assessment of the claims. I think there is a solution to part of the problem, and I want to make a pitch for micro-level research conducted in a non-ideological way, a way that does not equate sex work with trafficking. And I think there's two advantages, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to micro-level research at the city level and perhaps at the regional level. And Tom Steinfeld is going to be talking about this later today with regard to Cambodia, I think, where he's done some extremely interesting ground-level micro research. I think we get more reliable numbers at the micro level, and we can also get richer data on the lived experiences of people who are involved in migration and coercive and deceptive trafficking as well. I think micro-level studies can illustrate the defects in the dominant paradigm by showing where the evidence supports it and where it doesn't, and would, in the aggregate, highlight a continuum of experiences, patterns, that some individual experiences fit very well with that dominant paradigm and others don't at all. So I want to just give a few examples of some fairly recent studies that are all micro-level based that seem to support my basic argument. I won't describe these in detail, but each one of these studies, all of which are published, does sort of support the point I'm trying to make. Gostiak's study of 142 minors who were trafficked into the US from Latin America. Nick Mai's study in 18 European cities of young men who sell sex in those cities, 16, 17 years old often. Now remember, minors by definition would be considered trafficking victims. Neil Howard's recent research in Benin, young people who migrate from villages to work in the mines and quarries in Nigeria. And he's done a lot of ethnographic research there, observations, in-depth interviews. All would be trafficking victims by virtue of age. I accept that. But each study documents a high degree of agency among the people who are being trafficked. A lack of coercion, a lack of deception, and shows that the lived experiences of these individuals are much more complex than the conventional wisdom suggests. There's also a study, Blanchett and De Silva looked at 3 studies in Brazil of prostitutes who had been prosecuted under Brazil's trafficking law. Prostitution by independent workers is legal in Brazil. And in most cases, there was no coercion, deception, or exploitation in any of these 3 studies, but the law has been used to crack down on sex work, not trafficking per se. So that, again, I think complicates the picture a bit. According to the authors, the Brazilian government is cracking down on using the trafficking law to crack down on prostitution, which is legal if it's independently done. A few more examples. Belanger's study of 646 labor migrants in Vietnam. And she did in-depth interviews and a survey with them. Big study. It's about ready to be published in the issue of the Annals that you mentioned, Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. 2/3 reported no deception, abuse, or exploitation. And these were in-depth interviews, and they did try to probe. These were people who had returned to Vietnam from other countries in the region, so they weren't working in Cambodia or Thailand at the time the study was done. They were returnees. 1/3, however, did report abuse. And this included confiscating passports, being confined at a workplace, denied sick leave, denied any kind of phone communication with the outside world, being prevented from leaving the job, and receiving wages that were much lower than what had been promised at the outset. 60% assessed their experience positively and would do it again. 40% did not. And they cited the income that they earned, the ability to get better housing in Vietnam after they returned, and the benefits for other family members. But 40% had negative experiences overall. A book that just came out by Colin Chin and James Finkenauer, Selling Sex Overseas. Fascinating book on 159 Chinese female migrants who migrated to 7 cities within Asia, as well as to Los Angeles and New York City, for the purpose of engaging in sex work. And they look at 2 stages, the transit stage and what happens at the destination. 149 of these 159 were assisted by an intermediary, most of whom were other prostitutes who had recruited them to work in Taipei, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, Hong Kong, Macau. The women, none were coerced into the work, and these were, again, in-depth interviews that the 2 authors conducted. Few felt that they'd been unfairly treated by a facilitator during the transit stage, and only one, reported violence by a male Taiwanese facilitator. They tended to display a strong sense of agency during the migration process. They worked, they returned home, they migrated again, they returned home again, often because of visa requirements, limiting their stay. For instance, someone in mainland China can only stay in Hong Kong or Macau for 2 weeks and then has to go back and then reapply. At the destination, we find these kinds of results. 15% reported that they were not free to move around or quit work because of debtor or the employer retained the travel documents. 26% were classified as exploited by Chin and Finkenauer, using the measure of the woman receiving only half or less than half of the client fees. That's one measure of exploitation. 8% had experienced client violence, but yet 80% did not regret the decision to engage in sex work, largely for the amount of money that they made in these other cities compared to what they could make in China. Many of them had worked in the sex industry in China prior to migrating, but not all of them. That went faster than I expected. So that leaves some time for questions. Basically, we've got the discourse, the different types of organizations involved. I think that these data from various recent studies show how complex some of these experiences can be. and tend to challenge some of the conventional wisdom, certainly with regard to the macro level numbers that are propounded. And so maybe I'll stop there and open it up.
Thank you very much for that. So questions from the floor? Graham?
Well, thanks very much. No, I like your point about agency. As you know, I've been doing a study on male sex work for a number of years now, and I'm not aware of any degree of coercion like that in young men act with agency. But I'll come back to that later maybe. Just a couple of questions about the presentation. How do you explain the dominance of religious groups in these anti-trafficking endeavours? That's my first. Like, I could talk about Northern Ireland, it's the same. There are certain groups here. And how do you explain the alignment of certain strand of feminism with those same religious groups, even though objectively they may be antithetical to their interests in terms of controlling reproductive rights and so on and so forth? And finally, how would you explain the almost total absence of any discussion of male sex work within this dominant trafficking discourse? So they're all related questions.
All great questions. I'm not sure exactly how we understand, let's say, these radical feminist organizations that are adamantly opposed to all kinds of sex work, but also support abortion rights, women's rights, lots of other things that many of these groups on the radical right are adamantly opposed to. I guess I would conclude that they are basically suspending their differences on those issues because trafficking trumps all of those other issues. They're more committed to trafficking, perhaps, than the other issues, and they put them aside. That's one explanation. I don't know anyone who's done research on those organizations, the leaders of those organizations, and how they make sense of their alignment and coalition with groups that, on other issues, would be opponents, except to say that trafficking trumps everything else and becomes the dominant concern. Male sex workers, why are they left out of the discussion? Very good question. I think in general, victimization is seen to be more serious for women than men, more of a risk, more of a threat, exploitation as well. And there's an assumption in the public, in government, and even in academia, that male sex workers have more agency. And so therefore their involvement in sex work and even in trafficking is not problematized in the same way that it is for women. And there's much less research on male sex workers in general than on female sex workers, and almost nothing on transgender. For the religious groups in the coalition, they also are willing to suspend their opposition on these other issues because trafficking trumps everything else.
Tom and
just one sort of comment on that. In my work in Thailand from 1989 to 1999, data gathering was published in a book called Working at the Bar, and 2002 publication, A-Lens. We studied over 2,000 sex workers. Most of them were female. However, we did get some numbers on the approximate proportion of people who are working as males and people who are working as females. And the people working as males were certainly no more than 90% of the total. Probably less. If you speak to males who are into that kind of thing, they will estimate the number of homosexuals generally at around 12 to 14% male homosexuals. Lesbians usually left out, but 12 to 14. The actual numbers appear closer to 7 to 9%. I don't know that that's an explanation, but you can say, well, it's smaller, so maybe they didn't, but that's not a good explanation, but maybe that's part of it. So,
but my own experience from Prague and Berlin is that only a very small percentage of male sex workers actively identify as homosexual anyway. Most will say they're either straight or bisexual, but they say gay pay or
You're right, I confused those two certified practices.
If you look at the discourse of those type 2 organizations, it's always about women and girls. And that the two are linked. Those are the victims. Men are never mentioned. Okay? Yes, in the very back.
Okay, so 2 questions. One question that I had, how you are yourself distinguishing sex work and trafficking? Because in a number of points when you were criticising Shelley, you were sort of saying, well, she talks about sex versus labour versus trafficking, and then you sort of said Obama, he distinguishes sex from labour, which would, I would assume, which seems, I would then think that you're making a distinction then between sex work and trafficking and labour. So I just want to know how you're actually, what your understanding is of the difference between sex work and trafficking. And the second question is, I just wanted to maybe problematise a bit the way that you discuss the term or notion of coercion, and also the way that you just talked about as well, Grant. And because I think that, and this is what I think that we can take from this strand of feminist thinking, and also much more complex and nuanced feminist understanding and writing on this, of which there is vast writing, which is the way that coercion for a number of victims, whether we can identify them or not, is tied up in a really complex dynamic of gender and power. And I just wonder, when you were talking about your micro-analysis, how you intend to kind of recruit these victims, many of whom will not even identify themselves as victims, but who might, under this definition, or even a definition that has something like coercion in it, actually come under that definition. I mean, we see similar problems with the notion of consent, for example, in rape cases. What does consent mean? How do we define, or how do we actually decide whether somebody has the capacity to consent? I mean, it's very problematic. So I just wonder if you can speak to those questions.
I'll start with the first one. So the distinction I make between sex work and sex trafficking, good question. Sex work can be coercive, done under deceptive circumstances, without consent. It can be independently engaged in by people with full consent. There's a continuum of consent, I think. So much research has been done on street-level prostitution, and a lot of that has been generalized to prostitution. We know much less about indoor prostitution, especially in the first world. But what we're learning, the trend in research, is that there's a lot of indoor workers who've never worked on the street. A lot of them are independent. They work alone. They decide their working hours, their prices, who they will see. There's some cottage industry models where 2 or 3 people work together out of one flat. A lot of agency there at that end of the continuum versus the other end. Okay? So unfortunately, a lot of the street prostitution findings have been extrapolated to prostitution in general. So that's part of the problem in the literature. But I would think that there are variations, and significant ones, between at the different ends of that continuum, and everything in between, mixed experiences. It might not begin as consent, but later develop into a more consensual relationship. Someone might begin working for an escort agency, but then go independent. That happens quite often, because escort agencies take about 40 to 60% of the earnings. And once you learn the ropes, the tendency is for people to go independent. So there's less consent or less control over your working conditions if you're working for an agency than if you're working by yourself, pretty obviously. I'm sure if that's answering the question.
So your understanding of sex work is that it is labour, that it is work?
Yes. I would look at it as a type of labor.
So there's a false distinction in the sense between sex work and labor. Sexual exploitation and labor exploitation is a false dichotomy there.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin?
Well, sorry, I don't think I answered the second part.
Sorry, which was
of the question, which had to do, right, with how we conduct research on sex workers who have a lot of reasons not to participate in research. They're invisible for the most part. That's a great question. And I think the studies that have done that have tried to build rapport, have worked through third parties who've introduced them to sex workers. Colin Chin and James Finkenauer worked through intermediaries to get access to people. They also hung out in red light districts in these various cities got to know some of the managers, and then independently interviewed some of the workers. Going through the managers is probably not the best strategy, because you might self-select, or the manager could cherry pick those who have the best. It's difficult to get access to sex workers and to get valid responses from them. But it can be done. I mean, there's a ton of studies out there, but the researchers have to work extremely hard to make sure that the data collection, that they've gained the confidence of the workers, which is a big if, and that the material that's being provided, the information, is valid. So I think it takes more work than maybe in some other areas of criminology, because of the stigma and the vested interest that people who work in this industry have of remaining in the shadows. So I don't know if that responds fully, but yeah.
Ron, this was fascinating for me and a little eerie in that I was living through everything you were describing over the last 15 years. I was actually involved in those debates and the fights and the government actions and so forth. And I feel like, a soldier who's taken part in the American Civil War and marched through all the battles and campaigns and then ended up in a seminar where the war was being discussed. So there's a lot of little things that I'd love to share with you. For example, some of your left-wing groups that you said were non-religious, in fact, are religious groups. They have very deep religious foundations, but they're just not explicitly stated.
Like the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women? Would
Like,
that be one of them?
like Polaris,
Okay.
for example. Oh yeah, absolutely Canada, but Polaris in particular. I was thinking people that I've known for a very long time, and I know sort of the backstory there. And I've also got some backstories that would lead you to a Freedom of Information inquiry that might find some very interesting things for you in the Bush administration. But I wanted to give you something that, like having someone fall out of the past who can actually corroborate, I want to tell you why your claim about number 3, I want to give you the absolute foundation answer. So,
Let's just remind us of claim 3 again.
which was the one about, this is the 3rd largest or 2nd largest of all organized crime and so forth. I know exactly where that came from and exactly how it happened, because I said it. In a meeting at the United Nations, Office of Drugs and Crime, I was the consultant on human trafficking for the establishment of the trafficking part of ODC in the year 2000. It was a closed meeting, and someone said, so where do you think this lands in terms of other types of organized crime that we're working on here at Office of Drugs and Crime, drugs and arms like that? And they turned to me because I was the data guy, and I said, listen, no one knows the answer to that question. It's impossible to answer that question. If I had to guess, I would say it was 3rd. But no one could answer that question. And it was a closed meeting. We were just having a discussion. But there was an internal reporter who wrote it down. And then about 9 months later, it came out as a report in which it said, trafficking expert consultant explained to group that... Unnamed, yeah. And I never admitted. I said, I'm going to keep stum on this.
Well, I'm recording you now.
Now the statute of limitations, I feel like, is right. But and I kind of wanted to watch it. This false, what I knew to be false claim, but it was UN, and I couldn't do anything to really stop it. So it says it's the 3rd largest. And I thought, this is nuts. Everyone in the meeting, we all understood that you couldn't do this. What was then very fascinating to me was over the next 3 or 4 years, watching it climb up as exactly the
number
groups,
3 to number 2,
as the groups that we were talking about decided to inflate the claim that was previously falsely stated anyway, and it began to be pushed up to number 2. And there are actually, I actually tried to document that. I did a research assistant on searching the web to see how many groups had been bumping it up, right, because they wanted it to bump up. And then we even began to see, just in the last 2 years, people trying to bump it up to number 1. So it was, falsehood based upon another falsehood. It was translated to another falsehood, like that. So
a case study of how a claim becomes a conventional.
Precisely, yeah. So, I mean, in fact, you know, it wasn't those cannons on the left side of the battlefield, it was the ones on this other side that all failed to go off, right, in that particular. But that one, I know it's an anecdotal, but that's precisely where that came from, and precisely how it all went forward.
Are you willing to go public with that?
Yeah, now I'm ready.
Questions? Go ahead. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Rob. I find the area absolutely fascinating, but it's not my area at all. And like to me, you made it very clear what the advantages to the micro level approaches. But I'm interested, you know, with using that approach, are you able to then compare other regions, or is that something we shouldn't be doing because we shouldn't just focus completely on micro? Because essentially the macro level really is so that there can be a comparison, you know, country to country and across the world. So that's my question.
Good question. You could imagine micro-level studies of various cities within a country like Cambodia or Thailand, and then using those micro-level findings to reach conclusions about the national level patterns, but that would leave out all of those small towns, anything that wasn't in the sample, rural areas. There is trafficking in rural areas. So that's not quite the question, but you're interested in comparing, let's say, Bangkok with Saigon.
Yeah, or is it something we should be doing at all?
Should we be doing that? I haven't given much thought to that. I think if there are solid, well-conducted, ground-level studies, that's a lot of ifs, that we can compare cities. And I wouldn't see why not. And might learn some very interesting things about how Saigon compares to Taipei or Los Angeles to New York.
Yeah, that would tell you something about the culture and
Oh,
how
that
that will
will, yeah.
need and things like that. Yeah.
Right, the demand and also supply issues. I haven't thought much about that, where to go with that micro-level stuff, but I think that would be
Inform theory.
What's that?
I think informing theory by doing very strong, rigorous, micro-level work. I think the purpose is really to understand the phenomenon, right? And so if you have that kind of data, it will at least tell you what your theories need to be sensitive to in more of an aggregate way.
Right, and I think the work that I was citing shows the complexities
Absolutely.
on the ground. Yeah.
Ron, one final question.
I'll just make a very final comment. I've studied Bangkok very thoroughly. I've studied Phnom Penh very thoroughly, and all of Cambodia, all 24 provinces. I've been there, and my data reports are out. Saigon, I considered studying Saigon, but Saigon is so completely different from either of the other two. Saigon is communist. I mean, it really is. Communists are some of the most Puritan people, or puritanical people. If you look at the writings of Lenin and whatever, it's like, you know, prostitutes are not part of the proletariat, they're the bourgeois, and let's get rid of it. They sound like Christian ministers, you know. And so communists and Christian ministers have exactly the same line on that. And when you start going in there and you see police vans coming out around, blocking off streets where the hookers happen to be working on that particular night because they have to run from the police in Saigon, whereas they don't have to run in other places or try to protect themselves. Now, when the cops going in and beating those poor women over their heads, they let the customers escape. These people are doing it up against trees, because they can't come down else. How do you compare that, outside of what I just said, with these other places where it's at least quasi-legal? It's a very difficult.
So holding the legal structure constant,
Yeah.
in case it's only within a particular legal.
You know, you just can't. It exists everywhere. It's always going to exist. It always has existed. But it depends on how you're going to treat it and for what reasons, what we're trying to accomplish.
So what you argue is that there are far too many variables to compare.
I don't know. I would never be in a position to be, well, there are too many variables, so we can't study it. I don't want to be, that's not my quote. But it's a difficult thing. You have to ask certain types of questions. What can you exactly learn from doing it?
I'm going to ask a bit of a strange question, and apologies to non-academic colleagues here in the room. If you're interested in undertaking a micro-level study where you want to go out, say for example even within Belfast, to go out and study people who may have been trafficked or sex workers, how do you start to negotiate the university ethics committee?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is some evidence that I've anecdotally from people who have tried to do that and have run into blockages, barriers, questions that they couldn't answer about safety, security, anonymity, and everything else. Less about the validity issues, okay? And so I am aware of some studies that have been blocked because they're studying sex workers, not necessarily trafficking, but sex work. And so I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head here. I think if the protocol and your proposal identifies a set of safeguards, myriad safeguards that you will employ in getting access, doing the interviews, safeguarding the material, using pseudonyms, all of those kinds of strategies that we would use in any sensitive research topic, you're more likely to get IRB approval. It sometimes depends on who's on the IRB.
Yes.
And at my university, it's been difficult for people to get even fairly innocuous criminological research studies approved. PhD students, MA students, and faculty. So I think that's a great question. I think maybe some others have good answers for that.
Are there any insights from the field?
No, well, I was speaking about this later, but Ron and I have just got a grant to do a multi-city study of sex work, and we're currently in the process of doing it.
So we haven't been denied yet.
Yeah. Well, I have it written, but Ron needs to look at it, obviously. But one of the ways we're going to approach sex workers is through third-party sex worker rights groups, as opposed to, in terms of victims of trafficking, I'm not sure what victim of trafficking is, or at what point someone becomes a victim of trafficking, because the whole thing is just left in the air, but happy to discuss it later.
Tom?
I would give two possibilities. One, sometimes, depending on the particular IRB, not only the university or institution or whatever, but also the people on that IRB, you can say, well, this is a purely observational study in the sense that anyone can walk around and do anything else. Some IRBs are totally opposed to this. I argue if I talk to my Aunt Gertie over the back fence, according to the IRB, and then later use that for anything, I had to get their approval first, so I can't talk to Aunt Gertie over the back fence kind of thing, which is absurd. I have been arguing against IRBs for quite some time. I consider them combinations in restraint of research intentionally, and I don't think they have any business existing in most places, in most cases. Because of that view, at the University of Miami, I was sentenced to 5 years on an IRB. I managed to serve only 2 years of my intended term, because for the entire 2 years, I took 90% of the things I was looking at and said, we have no business looking at this. There is no business being in front of an IRB passive. Well, they got tired of me doing that and holding it subsequently finally said, thank you, we will need your services. But really, I don't know how you deal with that. There was no reason to have those kinds of IRBs. Yes, some kinds of research needs to be looked at. Good collegial kinds of things where you look at somebody else's research. So, I do this, you might get in trouble with that. But how many people are killed in traffic accidents? What do we do with people who drive cars? We license them ahead of time. We don't make them go every time they're going to drive a car and go to some board and say, hey, can I drive the car today? We don't do that. We license them, license people, okay? License researchers. If you make a mistake, do what we always do with legal situations. This is a law school. We punish people after the fact, not before. What are IRBs even doing in existence? I'm sorry. I'm slightly prejudiced on the point.
Well, because when we proposed that work on the trauma caused to academics by IRBs to document this kind of serious, mental health issue, we were sadly denied permission to do it by the IRB because we'd have to get into psychological science. No, the real answer is that I don't know the question. Instead of making a joke at your expense, it was just that 2 ways in the past that I dealt with it, but there are workarounds. One is a group like the National Institute of Justice in the United States, which is used to funding work on research into all sorts of dicey situations, to put it in a big umbrella. If you're working with their guidelines in front of you, it at least allows you to go to an ethics board and say, look, we're going with the best guidance according to those who normally fund and support this kind of work. And then the other way is, which is usually acceptable in many situations, is that you're working with an NGO partner. So that you kind of offload the dangerous stuff onto the NGO partner. And you keep, you have a certain responsibility that you say, there's a demarcation, it's a partnership, and you let them handle the parts that you know that the ethics board might be a little concerned about. But of course, and the NGOs there all the time anyway, they work in that space. If they're working as a service provider, so in a sense, they're also providing their own oversight. But they also know, for the people on an ethics board who don't have a sense of what it's like to work with people who are in slavery, for example, they're just clueless in many ways. It's very few people do it. And so they're very nervous, as they should be. That's a reasonable response to that lack of knowledge. But if you have experts, and you can offload it to the experts in a way, it can keep you safe.
Final thoughts? Such a great response. And Tom, you're exactly the kind of person who should be serving on an island. And I'm actually going to recommend that you be reappointed.
For your sins.
With that, I'd like to do two things. First is to thank Ron for his presentation and the lively discussion. And second, to invite you to lunch.